Matcha and Sencha are the two most famous Japanese teas, but what's the difference? There are 6 distinct differences between matcha versus sencha when it comes to flavor, preparation, health benefits, and more. We're going to cover all of them in this video, and by the end of it, you'll be a green tea expert. Before we get started, there's one important thing worth mentioning. A lot of people ask what's the difference between matcha versus green tea. So matcha is technically a type of green tea, and we'll explain why later. But instead of comparing matcha versus green tea, we're going to be comparing matcha versus sencha, which is what most people think of when they think of a green tea. So matcha was actually the original tea consumed in Japan, and it's still the tea used in the Japanese tea ceremony today. In the 1700s, sencha began to overtake matcha as the most popular tea in Japan. And this is where the discussion between matcha versus sencha first started. Many people were tired of the strict rules and principles of the Japanese tea ceremony, and they wanted a simpler way to prepare tea. Sencha was a tea invented by the tea farmer Nagatani Soen, and it took off in popularity because the leaves could be easily prepared in the teapot, without all the steps and utensils used in the tea ceremony. So this brings us to the first main difference between matcha versus sencha. The most obvious difference between the two teas is that matcha is in powdered form and sencha is in loose leaf form. This affects just about every aspect of the two teas, from the production to the health benefits and the flavor. Later, we're going to discuss the differences in health benefits between these two teas, but suffice to say that matcha is much more potent than sencha. You're consuming the entire leaf compared to just an infusion, so you'll be getting a heavier load of nutrients in matcha versus sencha. The fact that the tea comes in powdered form also affects the flavor and how the tea is produced, which we'll also discuss later. When you powder the tea leaf, you concentrate the flavor and make it much more bitter. If you were to make sencha powder, for example, it would be very bitter. There are special steps involved in the production of matcha to make it taste naturally smooth as a powder, all of which we're going to cover. But first, let's start with the next difference between the two teas, and that's how they're grown. Before a new tea is made, of course the plant must first be grown and harvested. This may seem simple, but there's actually a lot of thought that goes into it. First, the farmer needs to decide what type of tea plant to grow. 70% of the sencha tea in Japan is from the Yabukita cultivar. This tea plant produces a broad spectrum of flavors from grassy to sweet to savory. It also produces some of the toughest tea leaves. This is important in Japan, as the winters can actually get quite cold here and tougher leaves are more resistant to frost. If the farmer is trying to produce a lighter or sweeter tea, they may use a more rare cultivar like Saimidori or Okumidori. This is the difference between premium matcha versus sencha. You may notice that premium matcha has a wider spectrum of cultivars it's made from compared to sencha. This is because of the enhanced bitterness we mentioned before. People tend to prefer these smooth and creamy flavors in a matcha, and this is difficult to accomplish with the more common Yabukita cultivar. While Yabukita is still the most common cultivar for matcha, the most popular matcha teas we sell at neoteas.com are from the cultivars Okumidori, Goko, and Saimidori. In other words, Yabukita sencha appears to be much more popular than Yabukita matcha. These more delicate tea cultivars require more labor and they have a slightly smaller yield. In order for a farmer to grow these teas, they must make sure that they can sell them for a higher price. After the tea plant is planted, it will take 3 to 4 years before it can be harvested. You can sometimes see younger tea plants growing alongside larger fields, which is a sign that the farmers are making an investment in the future. But what type of tea plant is grown is not the only decision that the farmer needs to make. Before the tea is harvested, the farmer needs to decide whether or not to shade the tea plant. Shading is perhaps one of the biggest differences between matcha versus sencha. Sencha can be shaded, but matcha has to be shaded. Although shading is not necessarily a mark of a high-quality tea, the most prized teas in Japan tend to all be shaded. Kabuse sencha, gyokuro, and matcha are all shaded for a longer time, and these teas are noticeable for their intense sweet and savory flavors. When the tea plant is shaded, it retains higher levels of chlorophyll, caffeine, and theanine. When the tea is exposed to sunlight in the final days before the harvest, it will produce more catechins. This decision comes down to taste preference. If the farmer wants to produce more of these sweet and savory sencha teas like a kabusecha, they will shade the tea plant for a longer time. If they want to produce a drier and slightly more bitter sencha, they will leave the plant unshaded. Now we come to the third difference between matcha versus sencha. The harvest. In late April or early May, the tea plants in Japan are typically harvested for the first time. The last time these plants were harvested was likely in the fall of the previous year, so the tea plants have been able to store up nutrients for many months. The most desirable leaves are these light green ones on top of the tea plant. This is a similarity between matcha versus sencha, as they are both typically made from the youngest sprouts. Sencha is made from the top 3 sprouts, and matcha is made from the top 3 to 5 sprouts. These leaves are the most nutrient dense as well as the lightest and sweetest leaves on the whole tea plant. These tender young leaves are then harvested and brought directly to be processed. Once the leaves are picked, the farmer's work has only just begun. You see, what separates green tea from black tea is that green tea is unoxidized, while black tea is fully oxidized. Once the leaves are picked, the natural enzymes will begin to oxidize the tea leaf over time. In order to lock in the natural vegetal flavors of the leaves need to be heated within a few hours of being picked. In China, these leaves would be heated in a large pan, but what makes Japanese Sencha unique is that the leaves are actually steamed. These leaves are steamed for only around a minute, but in that time, the enzymes that cause oxidation are deactivated and the leaves are softened. This process is carried out for both matcha and sencha, but where the difference between matcha versus sencha arises is the decision of how long to steam the teas. This is a decision that only needs to be made for producers of sencha. If the leaves are steamed for a longer time, the sencha will become a fukumushi, or deep steamed tea. During this extra steaming time, the cell membranes of the leaf are broken down even further, and more of the leaf is able to flow into the cup. These teas are famous for their incredibly vibrant green color and their smooth and round taste. This is a technique a farmer can use to soften their tea even further. Deep steamed tea leaves are also a bit more brittle, and you may notice small leaf particles in the leaves. This increases the surface area of the tea, and it can lead to a more intense brewing. After the leaves have been steamed, they need to be dried. This is done in a series of small ovens that bake the leaves over time at a lower heat. The humidity content of the leaves needs to be between 4 and 7% so the leaves can infuse properly. While the leaves are still pliable, they can also be rolled into the proper shape. Japanese green teas are quite unique for this tightly rolled needle shape. This is one of the reasons the leaves need to be infused for a full minute. With gyokuro, a special type of green tea, the leaves are even more tightly rolled. For this tea, we recommend a steeping time of 2 minutes, ensuring that the needle-shaped leaves are fully opened up. Matcha, on the other hand, doesn't go through this rolling phase, but what it does go through is even more complicated. The leaves used to make matcha actually have to have their stems removed. The stems of the tea plant are not quite as sweet as the leaves, and because the tea becomes more intense as it's ground into a powder, the sweetness needs to be maximized, and the stems need to be removed. At this point, the leaves with their stems removed are referred to as tencha, and they are just one step away from becoming matcha. The tencha leaves are put into a large granite mill and ground into a fine powder. Inside the granite mill, there's a collection of grooves that force the tencha leaves outward as they are slowly ground into a finer and finer powder. This process is very time-consuming, and it can take up to an hour just to produce 50 grams of precious matcha powder. This leads to a big difference in price between matcha versus sencha, which we're going to discuss later. The next big difference between matcha versus sencha is the health benefits. When you drink a bowl of matcha tea, you're consuming the entire leaf. When you drink a cup of normal green tea, you're just drinking the water-soluble components of the outer leaf. This is a key difference between matcha versus sencha with regards to health benefits. As we discussed earlier, there are many things that matcha contains more of due to the fact that you're drinking the entire leaf rather than an extraction. Matcha is essentially a superpowered green tea. One example is the antioxidants. Matcha has more antioxidants than a normal green tea. While the difference between matcha versus sencha antioxidants isn't 140 times more like some sources suggest, it's likely closer to 10 times more. If you think about the preparation of a tea, this really makes sense, as most of the leaves are left inside the teapot when you brew a normal cup of green tea. Besides the antioxidants, we also have a difference in caffeine and L-theanine. Caffeine is produced by the tea plant as a defense mechanism to protect itself against insects. When the tea plant is under a lot of stress, like during the shading process, it produces more caffeine. In addition to this, because you're consuming the entire leaf, you're also getting all the caffeine inside as well. Even though matcha is a high caffeine tea, with about 68 milligrams of caffeine per serving of premium matcha, you won't feel the same jolt as you do with coffee. This is because the caffeine is also combined with theanine. Theanine helps the body slow the absorption of caffeine, so rather than getting a quick jolt of energy and then a crash later on in the day, you may notice a long-lasting, calm alert feeling throughout the day. This is why a lot of people are swapping out their morning coffee for a nice cup of matcha tea. But all these health benefits come with a price tag, and matcha is more expensive than sencha, which is another key difference between matcha versus sencha. A good ceremonial grade matcha sells for between $1 and $2 per gram, whereas a premium sencha sells for between 20 to 40 cents per gram. So why is matcha 4 to 5 times more expensive than sencha? There are a number of different factors that make matcha more expensive than sencha, and most of them have to do with the longer production process. The tea plant needs to be shaded for 3 weeks, whereas sencha can be unshaded or shaded for only 1 week. The shading process can be very stressful for the plant and reduce the total yield. Also, setting up and maintaining the netting can require additional capital and manpower. In addition to the shading, the removal of the stems requires additional machinery and manpower. All of these make the matcha more expensive to produce. By the way, if you're trying to save money on premium Japanese green tea and you don't want to compromise on quality, you should go to neoteas.com. We've traveled all around Japan meeting with tea farmers and sampling some of the best pesticide-free green teas. Feel free to browse our selection and pick up some of your favorites. Finally, we have the taste and the color. As we mentioned before, when you grind the tea leaf into a powder and mix it into water, it tastes completely different than a brewed tea. Matcha has a much darker green color and it's opaque, whereas Sencha tends to be yellowish green and translucent. The mouthfeel of matcha versus Sencha also could not be more different. Matcha is extremely thick, almost like milk or cream, whereas Sencha is more like a juice. This is because the concentration of tea leaf in the water is much higher with matcha. Matcha also has much more of these steamed vegetable and seaweed notes compared to Sencha. Thank you all so much for tuning into this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you want to try any different matcha or Sencha teas, you can find them all on our website, neoteas.com. We would really appreciate it if you could visit our website and try some of your favorites to help support this YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you next time.